Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Hall of Fame Committee, it's my pleasure to welcome all of our honorees, their guests and friends, to the induction of the 7th class of the Kansas City Golf Hall of Fame. I want to begin by recognizing the other members of our committee. First, my good friend and co-conspirator, a member of the Missouri Golf Hall of Fame, Jack Garvin. Martha Linscott, a multiple-time qualifier for USGA events, winner of the Kansas Women's Mid-Amateur this year, and the Mid-Am and Senior Women's Player of the Year. Past president of Central Links Golf, Greg Dunn, 2020 Hall of Fame honoree and longtime general manager and head professional at Heritage Park Golf Course, Rob Wilkin, executive director Doug Habel, and to several of you, several other members of the Hall of Fame who are here today, a special welcome to you. This is a labor of love for all of us on the committee. And unfortunately, we only get to do it every other year. Back in 2012, the Kansas City Golf Association was celebrating its centennial. And the Hall of Fame Committee was one part of our recognition of 100 years of serving golf and golfers in this area. The goal then, as it is now under the banner of Central Links Golf, is to preserve our past and honor the accomplishments and contributions of those who laid the foundation for the game we love today. This year's class is a continuation of the standards we have set to make the Kansas City Golf Hall of Fame a cherished honor. As you can see from the list of the 24 previous honorees in your program, it's not the Hall of Pretty Good. It's not the Hall of Longevity. It's not the Hall of Friends and Buddies. It's the Hall of Fame. So without further ado, let me get started. A few years ago, the Hall of Fame Committee recognized that there was a time when even the most accomplished players had very few outlets to display their talents and to build a resume that would land them in the Hall of Fame. We needed to institute an avenue for their induction that was fair, and we came up with a committee selection. This year, we haven't done it very often, but this year we have exercised that route to honor Miss Carolyn Lee. It's time for a trip in the Wayback Machine, Sherman. The year was 1915. It was the first year of a group called the Kansas City Women's Golf Association. To give you some perspective, in 1915 there was a war going on. They didn't call it World War I, because who knew there was going to be another one? It was the Great War, you know, the war to end all wars. The U.S. wouldn't become part of the fighting until April of 1917. Golf clubs had wooden shafts. The USGA didn't allow steel shafts until 1924, and they didn't catch on for several more years. The golf ball of the time was the Haskell ball, made of solid rubber or with a liquid-filled center wound with rubber bands and covered in balata. The balata ball was, or the Haskell ball was introduced in 1901 and continued as a standard for more than 6 decades. Courses themselves were rather hard scrabble affairs. Mowing was done with horse-drawn equipment, and grass greens, where they existed, were cut with non-motorized hand mowers. Life was hard, and hard scrabble was the order of the day. Appropriate apparel for the time for women included long dresses or skirts, and usually a bonnet or hat. It wasn't until the early 20s that women even dared to sport knickers on the golf course. It should be mentioned that there were no ladies' tees or forward tees. Everyone played from the same ground, and course records in the upper 70s and low 80s were typical. I told you it was hard. In the teens, the game had become so popular in Kansas City that the wives and daughters of many of the golfers who populated our 11 courses had taken to the sport and formed an organization of their own. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but Hall of Fame member Miriam Burns, whose photograph you may have seen when you came in to the clubhouse here at Milburn, was not the only woman golfer in her family. Her mother, Mrs. Clinton Burns, and her grandmother, Mrs. A.F. Beery, were also avid golfers. We've recently come across an article from the Kansas City Times, I think it was April of 1920, that has it wasn't a photograph, it was a line drawing of the three of them all engaged in playing golf. Many of the early clubs in in what would become the KCGA, part of really the fledgling Kansas City Golf Association, may be unknown to you. Names like Evanston, Elm Ridge, part of the Jockey Club and Fair Association, Gates Park in Independence, Shawnee Heights, which later became Tomahawk Hills. Some are more familiar, like Kansas City Country Club, no longer Kenwood in 1915. It had moved to its second home where Luce Park is now. Oakwood, which opened in 1912, Mission Hills, also 1912, Swope Park Golf Course, that would be the free course just inside the gates of Swope Park, and Blue Hills, you know, the old Blue Hills. From this group came several very competent players, but the best of the lot on the women's side was Miss Carolyn Lee. Evanston was located about where Southeast High School is now, and just outside the gates of Swope Park, and they used Colonel Swope's home as their clubhouse. In 1916, they moved to a new course designed by Donald Ross. You've heard of him. They called it Hillcrest. So who was this Carolyn Lee? Well, she was born in 1889 in Chicago, and her family moved to Kansas City not long after. Miss Lee's father, Thomas, was in the cattle business, and by all accounts, he was quite successful. Carolyn took up the game and thrived. She won the very first Kansas City Women's Championship in 1915, played at the Old Blue Hills. She defended her title in 1916 at Kansas City Country Club, as I said, which is where Luce Park is now. The next year, she again made the final match, but lost to a woman whom she had defeated the year before, Mrs. Cranston. We don't know much about Miss Cranston, but apparently she was a heck of a player. At the Missouri State Championship at Hillcrest in 1918, the 29-year-old Miss Lee and Miss Cranston met yet again, and Carolyn prevailed in what would be the first of 3 consecutive Missouri Women's State Championships. That 1920 tournament was notable for another reason, because in the semifinals, a young Miriam Burns showed up for the first time. Already the city match play champion, this future Kansas City Hall of Famer, and 1927 U.S. Women's Amateur Champion, would go on to an illustrious, if relatively short career, winning 7 city and 2 state titles, along with the Trans Miss and 2 Women's Western Amateurs. No wonder she's in the Hall of Fame. After Miriam Burns, and about the same time, a fellow Hall of Famer named Opal Hill came on the scene. Carolyn frankly struggled to keep up. She lost the 1924 city finals to Miss Burns, and lost to Hill in the 1925 final and the 1926 semifinals. After an outstanding amateur career, Miss Hill, by the way, would go on to become one of the 13 founding members of the Ladies Professional Golf Association when it was formed during the U.S. Women's Open at Rolling Hills in 1950. Miriam Burns seemed to have Miss Lee's number in the Missouri State Championship as well. As medalist, trying to make it 4 titles in a row, the now 32-year-old Carolyn Lee fell to the 18-year-old Miriam Burns in the 1921 and then again in the 1922 tournaments. That was the first tournament after the founding of the Missouri Women's Golf Association. And reports say there were some 200 entries and a gallery of more than 400 that followed the final action. Miss Lee's match play record in the Missouri Women's Amateur was a staggering 26-3. In 1923, Carolyn Lee won the tri-state title, that was Kansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma, defeating Miriam Burns in the semifinals, and won the Missouri Valley Championship, featuring players from Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Iowa, and Nebraska. Around 1930, the never-married Carolyn Lee returned to Evanston, Illinois, where she lived until moving to Florida, where she died in November of 1974 at the age of 85. She is interred at Memorial Park Cemetery, across from her beloved Hillcrest Country Club. The Hall of Fame Committee is proud to have chosen Miss Carolyn Lee as a committee selection to join the 2024 class of the Kansas City Golf Hall of Fame. Now, to accept the award on behalf of the new ownership of Hillcrest is Central Links Golf Board member Doug Albers. Doug?
Wow, this is a tremendous honor for Carolyn, and on behalf of the ownership of Hillcrest. I'm not an owner, but I did help in some consulting that they're doing on a major renovation to restore that club to its prominence. Should be open in 2026, and be very excited to display this and have Carolyn honored as part of Hillcrest's tremendous history. It's the second oldest club in Kansas City, which I don't know if you knew that, but excited for this, and well deserved. So thank you, Don.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, in 2026, there will be another class to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. Who will it be? I wish I could tell you, but we have a long list of about, Jack, 30, 35 potential nominees that we will consider as a committee in 2 years. And when we come up with those names, and by the way, I didn't mention that all of these honorees were voted on by a fairly broad group of electors. The members of the Central Links Board of Directors, all the living members of the Hall of Fame, unless their ballot got lost in the mail, Fred, representatives of Midwest Section PGA, and representatives of the Golf Course Superintendents Association of America. So, as I said, it's not the Hall of Pretty Good. It's the Hall of Fame. Well, I hope we'll see a lot of you back here or in our next induction in 2 years. And thank you very much for being here.